Hi, today I just want to explain a topic that uh, is probably a limitation nowadays. That is cross-domain HTTP request from client. So, if let's say you're calling a web service or an API that resides within a subdomain, it works perfectly fine when you call it from your local standalone application, but when you put it on a site, it is not able to support it because the target site does not have a cross domain mapping. So it is something like this. If I have to draw it, if let's say this is the target server that you want to call, and the target server, you're not calling the main target server, you're calling a sub server inside it. So I'm just gonna draw one more server here. This is the one that you're accessing actually. So what example I'm going to demonstrate is this target server is, let's say, Steam, and inside this you have API. So you're calling this particular request from your client. So this becomes your, let's say, client, which can be JavaScript, or it can be Flash, or it can be anything. So yeah, so if you call this application directly, you are accessing actually this. Sorry, you're accessing this. For example, I want to call you're calling this API. If you see this API, this is api.steampowered. So steampowered.com is your main domain and API becomes a subdomain. So if you have an application that is built on JavaScript or any other client and you're running it standalone, it works perfectly fine. So now you are all done. You want to move it to your target site, which let's say you have bought a subdomain. And if I just replicate this setup here, so this client that you're trying to call, it pushes back here, and then you are introduced with a site here. So your request goes to here, and then the request goes to here. This is how the architecture becomes, and from here you call your API request. This will not work because this server does not have a cross-domain mapping. Until unless this target API that you're calling supports cross-domain mapping, it is not possible to call this API from this becomes your website. It is not possible to call this API. You will never be able to call it until unless this target system implements cross-domain. So what I have done is the easiest solution. You might have read already this in a lot of articles, but I'm just going to show how it will if you want to implement it. Obviously, it should not be the final solution. The final solution being that this should implement cross-domain, but till the time it does not, let's look at what solution we should offer. So I'm just going to take the same architecture. Okay, let's remove these two for now. So the reason that this particular site is not allowing access to the APIs in subdomain directly because of security reasons. That is the only constraint. That means any client side, so this being your client. So if you see in real, this particular client is accessing this particular web service. It is going via your site, but it is actually calling this web service. That access it is not allowing. So The reason being the security again. What it expects is that the security constraint, for example, you are having a key to call a particular web service or an API from client to the server. The key that you want to use should not be lying with the client. That is the whole purpose of it. Okay. And if I draw your site here again, this is your domain. Okay, so this domain that you're having, should have the key information and all. This client should not have it. That is the only constraint from the server. Okay, so if you ask me that if I hardcode the key and all information in your domain and just call a URL from your client, will that work? If you ask me technically, yes, it will work. That is as simple as that. But how do you want to do it? The term that we call it is called proxy. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm just having a proxy here. Okay, and this proxy will integrate with this particular API, and your application will call this API. So it will not call the target API, and this API proxy takes care of calling this and returning the results. I will explain what I mean by this. So architecture will look like this. Your client application will call your domain, an API that is free of security and all. So it can call a normal GET request, it can call a normal POST request, or however you want it to be. So this part is up to you to program. Whether you want to do a JSON call, whether you want to do a HTTP call, it is up to you. But this call, because this becomes the server side for the client application, so the key and all information will be protected here. So you can construct a request in this API proxy, and you can call a plain GET request, it will also work. You can call a POST request, it will also work. So that is the solution. What I'm going to explain you is an example that demonstrates this get heroes for Steam API. So what I have done is I have my domain on PHP. So I'm going to just show you a simple PHP code that is written for a specific API that will return me the result of that proxy API. So this is my API code. So this is my web proxy. If you see, I'm just getting that particular URL. I have hard coded it. You can program into PHP based on what parameters you pass from this client application to this PHP. So it will just read the content. It will decode it into an array of objects and encode it to return into a JSON format, because I have my application running on JSON. So I wanted to return JSON format. Plain simple PHP code. You can construct a better efficient proxy in PHP, but for time being I'm just constructing a simple PHP page. So this is a PHP page that I've constructed, and if I go to the application, it is the same application that I showed it in my previous video, the Flex data grid from JSON. And instead of calling the direct API, now I'm calling my domain. Okay, and this is the same API that I have written here. So it will just return me get heroes, and these two applications I'm gonna deploy it on my domain, and then we'll see the results, how it behaves. So that is the only change I've done in my previous video. So earlier I was calling Steam API, but I'm now calling this, and I'm not passing any arguments here. If you see, now my arguments are within my PHP server side. The client is now aware of the arguments now. So the target system requirements, which is the Steam requirements, are met, that the client should not be aware of the key credentials to access their APIs. Okay, so what I have done is I have deployed it on my web page. This is the same application that is running on my web page. I'm gonna just click refresh. If you see, now I'm gonna click it, and if you go here, what method it was calling? It was calling this method, that is my within the same domain. So within the same domain, it has called the PHP. If I go to the PHP, it would have called this particular URL, and it would have returned me the details here. And I'm encoding into a JSON because my Flex is programmed to have JSON. You can format it as XML or whatever you want, but this being the fastest way, I'm using it. So if you see here, the code has properly integrated from the client to the domain and from the domain to the target domain. That's how we can bypass currently the incapability of the target server to map cross-domain files for the time being. Again, I'm stressing that the best solution should be the target server implements cross-domain mapping. Until then, I hope this solution is useful for us. If you have any clarifications, queries, please put it on to the video log and I'll be happy to answer.